Abby and Charlie, I just wanted to say thank you for sitting down to talk with me, and congratulations on the book. And one place, I guess, to start is the title, Why New Deal?
Thank you, Paul, for having us. We really appreciate being on the program with you. So we are intentionally referencing the concept of the New Deal, the idea of an all-of-government response, the idea that thinking about cancer in the next 50 years requires a more holistic 360-degree approach that thinks not just about the science, right, but about the role of government, social institutions, social structures, benefits, the whole gamut. And that's part of the impetus for the cover and the title.
Mm-hmm. Charlie?
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And to a large extent, Paul, the timing of the book, as you know, is the 50th anniversary of the signing of the National Cancer Act, or otherwise often referred to as the War on Cancer Act, which was, I think, an effort at the time to comprehensively attack cancer. And I think achieved, some major things. And in much of the book, we referenced that about what did we accomplish over the past several decades, but realizing that this is not the time to declare victory under any circumstance. And how do we advance science, public policy, disparities, access to care, how we pay for cancer care, how we deliver it, how we address the needs of healthcare providers. All of these things are really critical in terms of a comprehensive new war on cancer, or as Abby put it, a New Deal.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. You, it's a compendium of essays, of course, and you describe it as everything but the science. So it's kind of a fascinating way of looking at it, which is really the way I've been looking at it for decades now. And one question I had is looking back at the National Cancer Act, which I've been doing a lot in the past year or so. It's a little understood fact, little appreciated fact that it's a public health legislation, and really a monumental one at that it changes the way research is paid for, creating, extramural program. Nothing of the sort has ever been done anywhere in any country or in any therapeutic area. So have you been how does that fit into your book, that concept of here's a monumental legislation that's really is a New Deal?
Well, I can start. I think that it was a historic moment in biomedical research and cancer care delivery. And among the things, Paul, that it enacted was the creation of cancer centers, comprehensive cancer centers across the U.S., which are now numerous and in most, though not all states, which takes, I think, or builds upon the great work that was happening at the National Institutes of Health and the National Cancer Institute, and brings advanced care, research, clinical trials, innovation at the level of universities and major centers, academic centers of excellence, to bring it closer to patients and actually engage the talent that many of these centers and universities have to offer in our work against cancer. And in many respects, we take on what did we accomplish there, and I think we accomplished a lot, but obviously there's still a lot of work ahead.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think also if you look at the National Cancer Act, it was both incredibly ambitious, but also perhaps not ambitious enough. And not thinking about the healthcare system even more broadly in the way that we're trying to push in this book, right? So a real National Cancer Act, 1971, might have said, look, we just did Medicare and Medicaid in 1965, but there's still a whole part of the population that doesn't have access to health insurance, right? And so that would have been a different way to think about it. It might have also been a more holistic approach that integrated public health in a way that, quite frankly, hasn't been as sort of mainstream and sort of a core part of the cancer strategy as it has been. And then you could also think about some of the really interesting parts of the system in terms of the economics of how we pay for cancer care, not just how we pay for research, but how we pay for cancer care and how we support the institutions. One other thing I would add about this, and I defer to Charlie and you, of course, to talk more about it, is that act sort of created the structure of these national cancer centers that are throughout the country. But, you know, over the last 50 years, there've also been a proliferation of sort of local cancer providers and thinking about their role in treating patients and their role in providing access to patients who live much closer to their local cancer center than maybe to a flagship center like a Yale or Dana-Farber.
There are times and places in history when a collection of essays can make a difference. How did you choose the contributors?
So the book actually began in probably 2016 at this point. Charlie and I actually had developed a really keen interest in cancer policy. What does it mean to talk about cancer policy? What is cancer law? What is cancer regulation? What is the role that people who are not world famous oncologists like Charlie can do to do their part in the war on cancer? So I got very involved with that, and I wound up actually going to some of the Biden-Obama Moonshot Summit meetings and found myself a little dissatisfied with kind of the abstraction of what does it mean to do cancer policy? What does it mean to sort of break down regulatory barriers? And went to Charlie to try to develop an agenda to think about how the law school and lawyers and policymakers who are not scientists can contribute. And in doing that, we realized there was a lack of secondary material. It was very hard to get educated on what we had to do to accomplish that or to really have a positive intervention. So Charlie and I decided to have a conference. So we had a huge conference at Yale in 2018. There were 700 people there. It was the largest cancer convening in Connecticut history, and I think one of the largest conferences the law school has ever hosted. It was so much, we were overwhelmed by the interest. We invited a huge range of people to that conference, sort of the best and the brightest in each of their fields. And then from there, we sort of solicited interests for those who wanted to follow up and author chapters. And we really tried to tag a diverse array of people, from those who are leaders in the business sector. We have people who work at major pharmaceutical companies, to those who are government officials, to those who do the everyday science. Charlie, I defer to you on more on that point.
Yeah, and I think, Paul, you know, from Abby's perspective as really a leader at Yale Law School and leading the Solomon Center, and really a thoughtful innovator in how we look at healthcare. You know, this really started, and I have to credit Abby. You know, she reached out to me, came to my office and said, let's have a conference at the law school on cancer and the law. And I have to be honest with you, I had never conceived of the idea. And frankly, you know, from my vantage point at the Yale Cancer Center, I hadn't actually walked into the Yale Law School, but I did then. And it was the best thing I did. And I think a really exciting opportunity. And, you know, the people we brought in, spanning science, policy, disparities, healthcare delivery, how clinicians work. It was really a broad vantage point. And, you know, Abby points out that with the exception of science, I would actually say that both the conference and the book really thought about how we innovate in science and talked about the great accomplishments, because these things are all interrelated. I mean, you know, we had, you know, Otis Burley both speak and write a chapter. And, you know, what's clear is, sure, we can develop targeted therapies and immunotherapies, which have revolutionized cancer care. But if we can't deliver them to the broader population, what have we really accomplished? And so these things interrelate so significantly.
Mm-hmm. Well, what about like covering this, all of this? I'm seeing health equity becoming absolutely the central element of this, and questions of delivery, even though, as you know, while Obamacare has to deal with had to deal with a lot of setbacks over the previous administration's administration. So there seems to be an acceptance of this right now, at least in oncology, of the need for equity.
I mean, I want to not take some credit, but really sort of commend our contributors who way back, in 2018, before it was the central part of the conversation at this conference, were driving this point home. A really great story from this is that Harold Varmus, who was at this conference, and in hearing sort of discussions about clinical trial samples and health equity and disparities, as a result of this, a collaboration came out for looking to sample more kinds of cells, more kinds of cancer tissue from persons of all different kinds of ethnicities, right? So just bringing together different people who approach health policy from different perspectives is so instrumental. Otis Brawley obviously has been, and Blaise Polite, both obviously been at the forefront of talking about cancer disparities for a long time. And, we're just really delighted to have that work elevated. I think what's very interesting, as you point out, Paul, is how it's now in every aspect of thinking about the field and health policy. If you look, interestingly enough, at the final chapter in the book, which is written by Greg Simon, who was the director of the Biden Cancer Moonshot in 2016, he ends by saying, the most important thing we can do for the next moonshot is deal with this health equity issue. And I do think that the COVID-19 pandemic has had an important role in elevating the importance of healthcare disparities, giving a visibility that it didn't have, even though it existed before, the dramatic differences in COVID-19 outcomes for people of different cultures has really brought this front and center in a way that I think will have important fringe benefits for cancer policy.
Yeah, let's talk about that a little bit later. I'd love to do that. What should there be a new National Cancer Act? That's been sort of thrown around, this idea. I mean, I'm not paid for my opinions, but my answer would be no, just to get things started.
Do you want me to answer that first, Charlie, or do you want
to? You're the lawyer. You start.
I think it's interesting. I think it's a challenge. What does an act mean, right? Is an act just money, or is an act structural reform, right? And I think that is the question, not to dodge it, but to make it a little more nuanced. So we have a chapter by Rosa DeLauro, who's the chair of the House Appropriations Committee. And when you look at this chapter, I wrote it with her. We had a lot of discussions about what should be in the chapter. And I was pushing a lot of substantive legislation because that's my area of expertise. Exactly what you're talking about, Paul. What does an act look like? Should an act be disease specific, cancer system as a whole? And her response was, Congress plays a really critical role in appropriations. We have a funding power that nobody else really has. So a National Cancer Act that sort of just gives more money is obviously be very important, but wouldn't accomplish sort of structural reform, right? And so the kind of act that would have to sort of accomplish what we are looking at would have to include pricing reform, both in access to pricing, but also in allowing sort of value-based pricing and more innovative pricing regimes, but would also have to attack disparities. It would have to attack appropriations. It would have to give the CDC a lot more money than it has now and a lot more prominence in the cancer space than it has now. It would have to do a whole bunch of things. And it would have to find a way to incentivize a kind of private-public collaboration that all the authors in this book really seem to emphasize. Nobody thinks the federal government can do this alone, right? We need the private sector involved. So I think it would have to be an act of Obamacare scale in the cancer space to be something that would really be transformative, as opposed to, you could have an FDA Cancer Reform Act that might encourage quicker and more innovative development of drugs, right? But to have sort of another comprehensive 1971 Act, it would have to be, I think, extremely ambitious. And also, let me say, we need to take on things like data sharing, right? Privacy, the law of privacy and sort of in personal genetic information, which is so critical and important, as some of our authors point out, to the research, but also implicates a lot of sort of personal rights that people feel and hospital general counsels feel very protective of, right? So it would have to sort of look at the book the way we did, 360 degrees, and really address it in a comprehensive way. That would be very exciting.
Mm-hmm. So you're saying there should be, or?
I'm saying that if that was on the agenda, it'd be very exciting. I think something short of that, winds up creating a vision that's too narrow about what the war on cancer, the next generation of the war on cancer really should be. And right now where we are, there's nothing on the horizon that is tackling that 360 Affordable Care Act like expanse for the cancer space. And so to address in small scale, these are small interventions, but nobody should think that that would be a substitute, right, for a new 2022 National Cancer Act, right? An FDA reform, great. Right? Healthcare, health insurance reform, great. But something that is really that comprehensive would require a lot of ambition and a lot of motivation. And, you know, I don't know, Charlie, you tell me, in our discussions, we haven't seen many people calling for a new act, right? It's the kind of changes we've been hearing about, or those are from within. We haven't heard anybody saying Congress is the answer, you know, to this problem. I do think people think the power of the presidency is important, that the platform of the presidency is important in galvanizing faster, more collaborative research, but we haven't seen people calling for, you know, an Obamacare of sorts for cancer.
And Paul, I certainly hear you in that. I think just passing an act is naive thinking. And, you know, as you know, there were even critics when the National Cancer Act was passed in '71 that thought it was naive thinking, you know, including one thought leader who said that, you know, the idea of this act solving the problem of cancer is like trying to land a man on the moon without actually understanding Newton's laws of gravity. And, you know, in other words, we didn't know enough then. We know a lot more now, but I think what we also know is it's not as simple as let's pass an act and throw money at it. What the book and our contributors really point out are what are the things we have to tackle. And I think whether it be the issue that Abbe referred to in terms of open source data sharing, and there's a phenomenal piece led by a group by Charles Sawyers about that, about given the explosion of genomic technologies and all the information we are now gleaning, that's an extraordinary laboratory if we can pool these data and link it to clinical outcomes, treatment, et cetera. And it's you know, these are the things that we have to tackle. So I think that it needs to be very specific in terms of its intent in all of these things. You know, and the book points out, for instance, there's a great chapter, essay on the role of states in cancer care and cancer research. And we know, you know, there are states that have reaped the benefits of the tobacco, you know, agreement, but in fact spend 3% of that money on cancer research and cancer care delivery. And in fact, there are states that don't embrace, obviously, the ACA. And the evidence shows from our authors is that the states who don't embrace the ACA, cancer patients do worse. So, you know, these are the things we have to address. And on the science side, which is maybe something, Paul, you and I are perhaps more comfortable with, I don't think it's just throwing money at the problem. I think it requires a new way of thinking, and whether it be ARPA-H or something like that, where we really actually engage the broader scientific community. We're focused, we're milestone and delivery based, and we really, and we go after not the incremental advances, but the high risk, high reward things, realizing that failure will happen with some of these projects, but really do it in a way that brings the best focused on a problem and spans academic, industry, the works. You know, potentially we can even advance science as well.
The last time this was attempted was about 15 years ago, and this was fueled by the American Cancer Society. And the objection to that was that by putting together a kind of a cancer council and a cancer czar even, diluted the power of NCI and the role of the NCI director as the person and as a science-based sort of a manager of the entire program. So that's kind of like getting back to some history.
I hear you, and I think that clearly I think this type of thing, whether it be ARPA-H or otherwise, it probably needs to be housed ultimately or led within NIH. But I think it also needs to be a far less hierarchical organization. And I think it needs to be a flatter organization with project managers for each area that obviously bring together the best and the brightest with real resources, but also real expectations. I think there are examples, we all know it, whether it be the COVID vaccine or the Human Genome Project. When we put adequate resources and when we bring the right people together and we're very focused on the end game of what we're trying to accomplish, I think these things can work. And, you know, I think with that kind of an organizational structure within NIH and certainly under the authority of NIH leadership, I think we could do some good here.
No, I would say from my vantage point of just having come out of the administration, we're working on the COVID response, you know, there is a value to the coordinating power of the White House across the federal government and beyond. So we did have, in the context of the moonshot, there were some notable examples of the DoD, Department of Defense, working very closely with the healthcare agencies, right, to sort of establish sort of breakthrough therapies or create synergies, right? And if you were thinking about doing everything from incentivizing research to addressing disparities to fixing the health insurance system, you need more than just NCI, right? You need NCI leading the science, but you need that kind of coordinating push. We have a great chapter from Rick Shilsky that talks about the number of federal agencies that are involved in the cancer space and how they're often very fragmented and siloed and even turfy. You know, he uses the example of just CAR-T. One example follows it through the process, all the different ways the different agencies touch it. And you look at that and you think, okay, how are we going to break those barriers down and sort of push things ahead? The White House might have a role to play. It doesn't mean that the NCI is not in charge, but to have some kind of coordinator or someone that's accountable for bringing the whole force of the federal government and beyond together, you know, I think is valuable.
Yeah, and but that's also the central element of the National Cancer Act, and that the presidential sort of power, and it's wonderful to see it actually continue this way. And the one group that seems to have sort of lost its power is the president's cancer panel, because early on it was actually playing a role, and it really doesn't. No president's cancer panel member seems to be able to call the president and say, hey, something is missing. But that's just getting deep into sort of the weeds of it. But what about advocacy? Without advocacy, there would have been no National Cancer Act, and the whole thing would have looked much less interesting.
I mean, yeah, it's super interesting. I know that you're personally very interested in this, and I, you know, invite you to talk to us about Mary Lasker, but the whole story of the advocates at the time. But I do think we have a modern version of that in the book as well, right? This, you know, there's been well chronicled the role of the advocates during the time of the Nixon administration and sort of pressing for this National Cancer Act. But we have two fabulous chapters from Sherry Lansing, the entertainment industry executive, and Nancy Goodman of Kids versus Cancer, an advocate lawyer actually who lost her son to cancer. Both of them talk about the role of the outsider and sort of galvanizing Congress to do things. So one thing I think Nancy Goodman's chapter is very instructive. What she talks about is the number of cancers that have little financial incentive, and maybe perhaps even little incentive in Congress for focus, because it's the pediatric cancers is her example. They often serve a very small population. There may not be big money in those cancer drugs, and it's a small win for Congress. It's not a huge population that's effective. She points out that advocates have a very important role to play in those kinds of cancers in particular, and sort of focusing attention and finding ways to incentivize research for cancers that serve a small number of people. And I would look to Charlie to correct me if I'm wrong, but I do think one lesson that I took away from the book is that with the advent of precision medicine, there may be even more kinds of cancer treatments that are quite targeted and serve sort of smaller numbers of people as a whole. And one question is how to keep Congress and industry motivated to address all of those kinds of cancers if increasingly we're going to have therapies that are more targeted.
I mean, it's absolutely right, Abby. And you know, honestly, I looked back a couple of weeks ago at the chapters that Nancy Goodman and Sherry Lansing wrote, and frankly, they're inspiring, right? I mean, they each came from a story of personal tragedy, the loss of a family member, in Nancy's case, a child, in Sherry's case, a parent, and decided that they were going to do something really important. And I think what Nancy has done to champion work and research in pediatric cancers has had enormous impact. And obviously Sherry and her leadership of Stand Up to Cancer, I think, has been extremely important in raising money and actually creating an infrastructure that demands the investigators to work together. You don't get a grant unless you bring disparate people, the best and the brightest together, who aren't necessarily at the same institution, and where they're very much, as a recipient and also a reviewer for Stand Up, where they're very milestone driven. So I think two really accomplished individuals and patient advocates that frankly did amazing work and continue to do that.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting that cancer has never really gotten a kind of a pan-cancer advocacy, because I mean, Nancy is representing a very kind of a focused approach, very elite policy-driven approach, and Sherry Lansing also. There have been efforts to start things that are more like the AIDS movement, but cancer has never really, it's been balkanized. And maybe it should remain that way. I don't know. What are your thoughts?
What's really interesting, I love that question. What's really interesting, it's a great question because it's bringing back to my mind so many things I've been discussed in the book in different chapters. So what's so interesting about this is that the different kinds of cancer often have different lobbying efforts or different sort of constituencies in Congress, right? So we have a couple of chapters that talk about efforts to have a pancreatic cancer act, right? An act for a particular kind of cancer. We have a story about Harold Varmus opposing this sort of one cancer kind of act as sort of detrimental to the overall project. And one thing that Rosa DeLauro pointed out in her chapter, which was so interesting, she talks about the NIH budget. And this also came out in our conference. I'm an NIH expert named Eric Fatemi. They said the same thing, which is that the NIH budget is consistently bipartisan in Congress and consistently gets elevated, even if not as much as people would like. And the reason is that it is a budget that is holistic. The budget does not differentiate across different kinds of cancers. They view the budget process as cancer as a whole. So there's not internal infighting across particular cancers in the NIH budget. And Congresswoman DeLauro thinks that was very important for the success of the project and sort of urges that kind of, as you're saying, pan-cancer advocacy as a whole, so that different interests aren't sort of fighting Alzheimer's versus cancer, breast cancer versus pancreatic cancer, and so on. One challenge is how we talk about cancer going forward. Do we still talk about it as cancer, or we talk about it as many different kinds of cancer? Throughout the book, several of the authors said cancer is really many different diseases. And the more you label it that way, the harder it would be to come up with a pan-cancer lobby that thinks about cancer as a whole.
Mm-hmm. It would probably, if something like that were to happen, it would be the largest constituency in the United States and possibly the world.
And, political science theory, there are views that a large and diffuse constituency is not effective to advocate for Congress. That is a well-known political science set of theories, right? And so you need, concentrated interest groups where everyone is invested in the outcome of the success, right? And so Nancy Goodman's a great example. She's part of an interest group of people that are personally and holistically invested in pediatric cancer. Their life is structured, right, around bettering the world of others who have that disease. They're going to be the most aggressive, targeted, focused advocates. AARP is a very famous organization that has a diffuse group of interest, but they do have one issue. But the AARP, obviously, for older Americans, that could be a model. It is an example of an industry that has been effective in lobbying for a population, even though that population does have diffuse interest. But arguably, the over 50 population has more united interest than even multiple different kinds of cancers and the therapies that they have and survival rates that they have and so on. But defer to the scientists on that.
Mm-hmm.
And Paul, I think this is where the role of government is important, right? Because we know that both in cancer research and cancer care and advocacy, we have to commit to understanding the unique entities that are cancer, of which there are hundreds and maybe thousands when we start thinking about genetic subtyping. And that's the progress we're making in cancer. So we do need organizations like the federal government, and frankly, even Stand Up to Cancer, which is PanCancer, to ensure that there is equitable distribution across the needs of cancer patients and cancer research. But ultimately, I think these things are synergistic. But the thinking, both scientifically and I think at the point of the advocacy, I think it's going to continue to be very focused on unique cancers.
Well, I'm just looking also at the table of contents right now, and there's a lot of very interesting stuff on the economics of, well, insurance, but also economics of the Cancer Center. Maybe we should talk about that.
Well, I can certainly start, and Abby can speak to this with even greater expertise. I think, for instance, Ed Benz, who was the previous CEO of Dana-Farber, has a very insightful chapter of how cancer centers pay the bills, and it's a fairly convoluted Byzantine system of getting money through cancer treatments, getting paid that way, so that you can cover the things that are critically important, like social work, like psychosocial care, like nutrition, and pay for them because they're not adequately reimbursed, including even the time of the nurses and the the physicians, the healthcare providers. So we cover that, including even the cost of research and clinical trials, through payment of other mechanisms, and we get it done in cancer centers, but it creates a fairly complicated system rather than paying directly for the things that we see important in cancer care delivery.
Yeah, the EDGE chapter is really unique. We haven't seen anything like that in any other publication, and we're so happy to have that perspective. Barbara McInerney represents the view of small oncology practices, and she adds a complementary perspective on how the way small cancer centers are paid are different than large hospitals. And her view is the money should follow the patient, not the institution. And she talks about the ways in which small providers are sort of, in her view, systematically, economically disadvantaged from treating cancer patients in the same way. And she talks about the value of those local providers to the patients in the communities and the importance of sustaining them in this era of intense consolidation in the industry.
I guess maybe we should talk about pharma as well, and the economics of drug pricing, if it's really the issue. There's a lot to that issue. It's not just the drug pricing. It's more complex.
There's no question, Paul, it's complicated, and I think Carrie Gross and Zeke Emanuel take on, I think, a provocative point of view of the issues around pricing. And how do we do that? I mean, I will tell you, having now served in the role as a cancer researcher, a clinician, cancer center director, and now someone who leads hem-onc drug development at a large biotechnology company, and somebody who's even started a biotech company. I think these things are all critical elements in what we can deliver to cancer care. They're all equally important. I can tell you, in my current organization, the company does, it's a for-profit company, but we reinvest $13.3 billion each year into R&D to take on high risk, high reward, important projects, basic research, applied research, clinical trials, and try to do that in an equitable fashion. So let me just say that we are committed to reinvesting the money to really deliver the promise of what we think the science has to offer.
That's more than double the NCI budget, quite a bit more. So,
Abby?
Oh, I think Charlie covered it. I do think, what Ed did talk about in this is relevant again, to say that people sort of focus on drug pricing as the evil in the industry. And Ed's point of view is that, you can't sort of pull one lever in the cancer pricing space without thinking about the other levels, think about all the different things that various parts of the system are actually subsidizing. So one of the cautionary tales that he tells us is, be careful about reducing reimbursements for drugs, and thinking about what other services might be lost along the way if large institutions are using profits from that for other services like second opinions and, as Charlie just mentioned, R&D. So that just goes back to our point that this is really, it's a holistic approach. We have to think about the system as a whole. Zeke and Carrie also talk a lot about different pricing models, value-based pricing, pricing based on performance. These are pilots in the cancer drug pricing space that have been touted for a long time, or we haven't made a ton of progress on them. And that seems to me like something that is going to be the focus in the pricing space in the future.
Yeah.
And Paul, I'll just tell you also from this vantage point of a cancer center director, which I did earlier this year, there's no way that we could have adequately paid for what we needed to do at the Yale Cancer Center, candidly, without the reimbursement of the cancer treatments. I mean, we couldn't adequately compensate our staff. We couldn't reinvest in research. We couldn't start programs like we did, focused on immunotherapy, on brain tumors, things like that. And including, obviously, social work, nutrition, delivering prevention services to the community. Couldn't have done it. And that was really an important aspect of our mission. So I think Ed does point out the paradox of all this, and I think the chapter that Carrie and Zeke talked about pricing, I mean, it's important, but we have to realize that even as a cancer center director, without those reimbursements, we couldn't take on the larger mission of what we were doing for people in New England and when I was in that job.
So I guess we should talk about COVID. Abbe, that's your area of expertise, COVID and cancer. From the legal, I guess, point of view, the just legislative point of view, and where does it actually, what has changed as a result of COVID?
Well, look, I want to let Charlie talk about sort of the upstaging issue about people who did not get access to care early in the pandemic. And so, the idea that there may be more people with more cancers discovered at later stages is very important from the science perspective. I'll just speak to the policy perspective and let Charlie pick up on the science and other things. But, from the policy perspective, I think COVID has done a couple of very important things. First, it does show the ability of the research community to act quickly, right, with the right level of government support, clear milestones, and a sense of urgency, right? And so for all the sense of urgency that we've had in this war on cancer, COVID really shows us what can be accomplished with the right kind of financial incentive structure and motivation with government, public-private partnerships in particular. I think that a lot of people, including Greg Simon, who wrote the last chapter in the book and who was, as you know, the moonshot director for the Biden-Obama moonshot, feels that that is sort of a critical lesson that we have to take forward with us, right? That obviously was very high risk, but very high return. Second, as I mentioned before, I think that COVID has shed light on a lot of problems with the healthcare system in general that were there before, but now have prominence. And there's an opportunity to take advantage of those windows being open to try to capitalize on them. And I'll mention two in particular. One is our lack of infrastructure in public health. Right. So one thing that COVID has showed us is that we've kind of let our public health system fall by the wayside, public health and prevention. We saw that firsthand with, the lack of contact tracers, the lack of public health infrastructure we have across the states. In the cancer space, it translates to what Congresswoman DeLauro has been saying about, how the size of the NIH budget dwarfs, the CDC prevention budget by sort of embarrassing amounts. And Melinda Irwin and others write a terrific chapter on the importance of integrating public health prevention strategies. Just coming back to the Zeke Emanuel and Carrie Gross chapter, I think they point out that the biggest thing we can do to reduce cancer costs in the future is increase our tobacco prevention efforts, right? So if you think about public health and prevention, you're thinking about that. And then third, the other thing I'll mention in COVID, apart from the coordinating power of the presidency and the importance of the presidential platform and used appropriately, which I think COVID really does show us. The last thing I would just mention, we can talk further about this, is the spotlight it has shed on healthcare disparities and how lack of access to the same kinds of centers, the same kinds of early treatment, the same kinds of medication has an incredible impact on healthcare outcomes for different populations. Taking that lesson into the cancer space, I think, is incredibly important. The head of the Biden Cancer COVID Equity Task Force. Marcela Nunez-Smith happens to be one of the disparity director at the Yale Cancer Center. Very proud to have her as a colleague and someone that Charlie brought to camp, but shows that there is a connection, right? There are people who are working in the cancer space on disparities who are working in the COVID space now, and more of those lessons brought into the cancer space would be incredibly important.
You know, and Abby, I think that's all great points. I would just add from the vantage point of a cancer center director, Paul, I think the experience of COVID, particularly if you look at 2020, I think it really highlighted the vulnerabilities of our healthcare system, and also just the acts of heroism and triumphs that came out of it. I mean, I will tell you, running the Yale Cancer Center in the early part of 2020, when the pandemic really got started, and frankly in Connecticut, we had a significant burden related to New York in terms of COVID patients. It was extraordinary. I mean, the lack of PPE, right, that we had to ration masks, and frankly, the heroism of nurses, physicians, healthcare providers, you know, everyone who keeps the hospital going, working sometimes without adequate PPE because we didn't have it. And the fact that obviously, you know, cancer screening rates dropped 80% in the midst of this. But I think what also came out of it are the innovation, right? How we recovered from that, how we introduced telemedicine, how we obviously pivoted our cancer research operations to work on COVID, and really came up with some important insights in terms of the immunology and the treatment of this virus. So I think a lot of lessons learned. Good things can sometimes come out of a crisis, but I think Abby's point about we have to look really carefully at our public health system, and we can't let this happen again.
Well, what about really thinking about mRNA? You know, that is 50 years of cancer research gave us mRNA.
It's a great point. I mean, obviously, look, these efforts were in part started as a cancer vaccine effort, and hopefully that's something we'll continue to advance. But leveraging that technology to really create effective vaccines for COVID-19 is an incredible triumph of cancer research, and ultimately now research in virology and prevention. So so much, I think, comes out of these efforts, in large part because I think cancer researchers and companies focused on cancer research did pivot their resources to tackling this public health problem.
Which I guess gets us to the next question, which is ARPA H, because, you know, there's a question of engineering and cancer. We thought we were there. They thought they were there 50 years ago, that it's going to be as easy as putting men on the moon or a Manhattan Project, which were all engineering projects. But cancer was nothing like that. And, you know, ARPA H is about engineering. Are we there? Are we there yet?
Abby, do you want to start?
Yeah, I can start with the policy and turn to you for the science, Charlie. But I think, I think ARPA H in many ways is still developing. We're still early to talk about what it's going to look like. I think that it brings together a bunch of the different ideas we've talked about today, right? It's very self-consciously, not just a science program. The president has been very clear that an important component of it is going to be addressing structural issues like disparities. So I think that's an important piece of it. Obviously, there's a funding piece of it. And then there is a piece on capitalizing on the successes of COVID, sort of harnessing the high risk, high reward model of, targeted short-term government investment and private partnerships to sort of achieve, advances quickly and meaningfully. I think it's all of that. It's not everything in the book, it's not the pricing structure, it's not the insurance system, it's not the New Deal for cancer, but it's an important piece, and it's in many ways, I think, a logical follow-on of the COVID pandemic, combined with President Biden's experience about sort of the unique power of the presidency, even from the moonshot itself, as the last chapter reveals, how many collaborations were incentivized just by virtue of Vice President Biden asking people to work together in 2016, and sort of trying to put that on steroids now in a high-tech kind of way, with the lessons of the COVID pandemic behind us. Charlie?
Yeah, Paul, I think from the science standpoint, I think that ARPA H can deliver accelerating medical breakthroughs, but it's got to be not business as usual. I think it can continue and probably should be housed in the NIH. It should be under the leadership of the administration. But how we do it, I think that, again, it needs to be project managers in a fairly flat, lean organization who bring together the best and the brightest in a fairly silo-less environment that work on specific problems where there's clear focus, there's resources to bring to bear, and there are deliverables and milestones to be expected that are monitored regularly. That's going to require, I think, bold leadership. It's going to require significant investment, and it's going to require a really careful look at how we do the work, because it can complement, I think, the somewhat agnostic grant funding mechanisms we do, which I think do bring great value. But in this case, I think it has to be more focused and clearly milestone driven.
I think that's a great point also about sort of we did in the book in several chapters reflecting sort of the two arms of sort of high-risk translational rewards to add basic science research, right? Basic research, and the idea that ARPA H is focused, mission-driven, outcome-driven, while also, not giving up on the value of sort of the basic science philosophy and being able to preserve that alongside of a more targeted research program.
Maybe we can put it in a nutshell. How is it different from what NIH does? How is it different from what pharma does, from what industry does?
Well, I think that, I would look at either the Human Genome Project or the COVID vaccine efforts to say, how do we, I think those are different elements of what NIH or industry has done. And it involved collaborations with a very keen focus on what we were trying to accomplish, with significant funding and with a very important and obvious deliverable. That's very different than I think our current systems, whether it be in industry or in government-funded research. But it complements all of it. And what we need to do is bring to bear the talent across that spectrum with the adequate funding and support. And again, with an organizational structure that really is focused and committed to driving the mission.
Well, makes a lot of sense. Is there anything we forgot? Anything you'd like to close with?
No, Paul, we really appreciate your taking the time to do this. And obviously, Abbe and I are really proud of the work that our authors have done here. I think we think it's an important contribution and hopefully even a blueprint for the next 50 years.
Well,
Yeah, put perfectly, Paul. So let me just echo my thanks to you and to Charlie and to everyone who contributed to the book, helping us broaden the conversation to a broader policy conversation about the future.
thank you so much for talking with me.